Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Newsroom political editor Laura Walters, and with me in Wellington is senior political reporter Marc. Hi Marc.
Hi Laura.
And joining us from Auckland is Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy. Hi Tim.
Kia ora and happy Matariki.
Happy Matariki to you too. Now, today on Raw Politics, we will be taking a look at whether it's evidence or vibes leading this government's justice policy, the ferry fiasco and the latest political poll. And to wrap up, we will offer you some recommendations.
I don't care what you say about whether it does or doesn't work. We can have that intellectual conversation all day long, but we are, damn it, going to try something different because we cannot carry on getting the results that we've been getting.
Those are the words of Prime Minister Christopher Luxon when talking about the government's decision to bring back military-style boot camps for serious young offenders. He made those comments during the post-cabinet press conference on Monday. It has been a week of law and order announcements for this government, with details of the boot camp pilot announced on Sunday, along with extra commitment of beat cops in Auckland. Then following that this week, we had the reintroduction of the controversial 3 strikes laws, followed by tougher sentencing regime. All 3 government parties campaigned on getting tough on crime. So, is this a promise delivered, Marc?
I think there's a long checklist across the 2 coalition agreements of law and order policies, and there are probably still a few in there that have yet to be announced or delivered. But it certainly is the emphasis of the policy that the government's done so far, beyond the repealing and scrapping things that we've talked about quite a bit. This is one of the big themes there. And it's pretty clear, if you voted for any of those 3 parties for a crackdown on crime, for the tough on crime approach, you are getting what you voted for. There's no doubt about that. A bit curious about, why it's so heavily front-loaded, and we've chatted about this in the office at least, about, it takes time for these policies to actually have an impact or just get through Parliament in the first place. And so front-loading these ones means that by the time they get to the next election, they can maybe say, look, crime is down and it's because of these policies that we've done, as opposed to if they waited 2 or 3 years, harder to make that sort of argument.
And just from a technical point of view as well, sometimes even after you pass a law, even if you pass it through under urgency, as is happening in some cases, it could still take about 6 months until the law is actually going to come into effect, because there needs to be education, IT systems updated, all of those boring but important things. Now, Tim, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that. Is it enough just to be tough on crime, or do we actually need to have, I guess, the evidence behind it to ensure that these policies work? They were very interesting comments, I thought, from the Prime Minister on Monday.
Yeah, they were. That quote on, I don't care whether it's right or wrong, or I don't care whether you say it's right or wrong. It was a real indication, broader than law and order, that there's a slight impatience in the government to get on, and to get on with experts and evidence and, examples and experience all put aside for now, because we don't need to be hampered and held up by them. We just want to get on. And so there's sort of a theme of momentum over considered or necessarily correct, and certainly over original thinking. So there's very little original in what we're dealing with here. These are things that are being dragged back because the Labour side of things ditched them or didn't act on them. And the truth is that some of these will take a while to take effect, Marc, as you say, and that could be around 2026, a couple of years from now, before any effects are seen, but they might not ever get their effects if this coalition can't retain power. Because sadly, in our system, the next lot will come in and decide, no, these don't fit with our thinking. Evidence aside probably as well, we'll just act on it because our gut tells us this is not what our people like and should have in our system. So it's a pretty dispiriting menu. I think they are showing momentum. Each week they're coming forward with a package of something, and this is a package of law and order. They did campaign on it. They did, I think, probably over accentuate how much crime there is, and we can talk about that in a moment. Laura, you've read that report on crime that's out this week as well. So I think they probably over accentuated it. Now they've got to deliver something, anything, that sort of gives momentum, and this is happening.
Yeah, let's talk about that report that you were referencing, Tim, the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey. It's been running for about 5 or 6 cycles now, so we're starting to see a good build-up of trends in terms of crime, victimisation, perceptions of safety, and of course this also includes crime that isn't reported to police, which is a big chunk of the crime that happens in New Zealand. It's interesting to see how there's that narrative from this government that people are not only feeling less safe, but they're right to be feeling less safe because there's more crime, there's more violent crime. There's kind of this picture of lawlessness, I guess, that is painted a bit by this government. But the statistics and the evidence don't actually seem to tell that story, do they? In this Crime and Victims Survey, the results that are just out, I think I just wrote it down, the Justice Minister Paul Goldsmith highlighted the 1.88 million incidents of crime that happened between November 2022 and October 2023. Now, that is a lot of crime, and I don't think that anyone in the country, left or right or in the middle, would think that that is okay. What he didn't say in his press release is that for the year before that, there were 2.47 million incidents of crime. So it's dropped, year on year by about a quarter there. And that's not part of the story that the government is telling, is it? And I know that you've looked at some of the statistics around violent crime as well, Tim, that came out in that report.
Well, interestingly, this series of reports that Justice has been doing, conveniently, if you think, for a government just coming in, run from 2018 to 2023. So that's a period which is, they're able, if you're a National Act or New Zealand First MP, able to say, well, look, this is over Labour's period, how things have got and how things have, in their view, worsened. So he can say it's a very high number of people affected by crime, and the number of people who are victims is up, and certainly up for some communities. Asian people report that they are higher victims of crime. Māori are lower in some areas of crime. So, but the actual crimes, violent crime, is no more than last year, and it's also no more than 2018. Crimes in the home of violence are the same. Burglaries are down on last year and on 2018. So there's a whole lot of common crimes that actually haven't moved a lot at all, or may have even marginally gone down a bit. So, it's a very difficult one for an incoming government that would hope, well, wouldn't hope for more crime, but would hope there'd be evidence for their assertions, and they're not really there.
And I think the other interesting thing to pick up there, Marc, and we've discussed this a bit as well, is around the perceptions, right? That despite what the statistics and the evidence tell us about these the incidents of crime and what type of crime is happening, but then the perceptions of crime, perceptions of safety in the public is another thing. And I think that's the thing that the government is responding to, isn't it, Marc?
Yeah, responding to and or contributing to in the question of perceptions of safety, right? Because perceptions of safety are shaped by the world around us, but also by what we read in the media, also by what we hear from our politicians. If you've got a government that's saying crime is out of control, or an opposition that's highly influential, say last year, and saying crime is out of control, that's going to contribute to those perceptions. There's also an interesting theory, and this one is I'll leave it at theory rather than proven fact, but the Public Interest Journalism Fund funded the Open Democracy the Open Justice Reporting Project, which put a lot more reporters into courts, which led to a lot more news reports of crimes. So is it possible that some of this perception comes, ironically, from that media policy that people accused the previous government of buying off the media to do good news? Well, maybe it contributed to a perception that actually crime was out of control.
That's right,
an interesting
actually.
theory.
Marc, look, I think that is correct. There were 15 reporters put on around the country to go into courts. And that led to a lot more reporting of what happens in the courts. And what happens in the courts can be pretty low-level, ugly crime, gang crime, domestic violence, hideous, human-on-human violence that come up in court. And what that led to, I think, in that election year and the year before, was a perception that there's a whole lot more going on rather than a whole lot more coming to our attention. and that's a probably a unfortunate byproduct of that, but it can happen. If you highlight things, people get a growing perception, maybe fear.
And I think the flip side of this is that while there might be perceptions of safety have gotten worse. People are feeling less safe overall. Even people who are not victims or have ever been victims of crime, they're, feeling less safe in their communities. At the same time, when you ask people, well, what would give you more confidence in the justice system? What would you like to see change? There is not this overwhelming amount of people that say, well, we need a more punitive response. In saying that, there are different surveys come up with different results. So one survey that's pointed to a lot by justice officials is when people were asked this question, what would give you more confidence in the justice system? Only 3% of people said a more punitive approach, harder, longer prison sentences. And then at the same time, 47% in a different survey thought that imprisonment wasn't used enough. So the evidence is mixed there, but we're not overwhelmingly hearing that New Zealanders want a punitive approach, and I don't think that's surprising when we think about who we are as a country, who we are as people. We want to be safer, we want to see crime come down, but we don't necessarily think that locking people up and throwing away the key is the answer. And this is the conversation I've had on multiple occasions with Paul Goldsmith, the Justice Minister now, said, well, what evidence are you pointing to, or are you basing these policies on? What are people telling you that specifically they want tougher sentencing laws, or do they just want to feel safer? Is this what people are actually calling for? And every time I ask him for his evidence or for his surveys, he talks about the election campaign. He talks about, what people told him on the street during that campaign. And whether or not we should, base policies on those vibes is, I think, a really important question. Yes, of course, they have to go out and do what people want them to do, respond to that public sentiment, but there does need to be a certain amount of evidence, and they have to be really careful of the unintended consequences as well with these types of policies.
But Laura, we haven't got time for your evidence. We haven't got all day to be sitting around talking about evidence. We need to get on, and this is the thing. This is the political dynamic. They would say, while there might not be great stats in favour of punitive prison sentencing, that there is anecdotal Facebook groups, people they run into the election campaign that want deterrence and want someone young to get a boot up the bum if they've done something property-wise or threatening or that kind of thing. So they're going on that, and I think there is a feeling of that. Like Marc, it's not scientific. I don't, have those figures, but I think it's fair to say people are impatient with street and property crime and sort of intimidating behaviour where they see it or experience it.
The problem is if we don't feel safer in 3, 6, 9 years because these policies haven't worked, what happens then? Or when the government can't meet its own targets around lowering, the number of people who become victims of violent crime, they've set that target for themselves as part of their core target suite, and the evidence doesn't really support this approach for lowering victimisation. So we'll see what happens in a few years' time around that. The wheels are coming off the bus, or at least the steering wheel is coming off the ferry. The grounding of the Aratiri Inter-Islander ferry, the pylon accident that led to all of Northland losing power for nearly 48 hours, and the government's planes that can't take off have sparked a lot of discussion about New Zealand's ailing infrastructure. The ferry issue in particular has also spotlighted the government's decision to cancel the contract for new Inter-Islanders and go looking for a better deal. The grounding would have happened anyways, as the old new ferries weren't due until 2026 at the earliest, but the resulting discussions have raised new questions about how cancelled that contract really is. Marc, what is the deal with the ferry fiasco?
The deal with the ferries deal, I wish I knew. It doesn't seem that anyone is super clear on really whether this contract has been cancelled or not. We were all under the impression that it was cancelled late last year. One of the first things the government did was put out a press release from Finance Minister Nicola Willis saying, look, KiwiRail has come to us asking for more money. These ferries were supposed to cost something like $750 million. Now the cost has ballooned out to $3.2 billion. A lot of that was not the cost of the boats, but the cost of the infrastructure, particularly in Wellington, to be able to handle much bigger ferries. But they cancelled the ferry building contract because it just wasn't worth it in their view. Or did they? On Tuesday, leader of the opposition, Chris Hipkins, said he had it on good authority that the boats were still being built. Right now, he said. Right now, they're still being built. And KiwiRail then later that day said, well, they're not still being built.
Halted.
Sorry,
Yes.
yeah, the construction has been halted. But does that mean permanently or not? We've been busting out the dictionaries in the Newsroom office trying to figure out, as ministers have not been saying anymore that the contract is cancelled, but they're saying it's been repudiated. What's the difference there? Not a lawyer, so I don't know. But it's really unclear now, suddenly, whether those boats are on the way or not, or what the government is going to do to replace the ferries. They have stated that they will try and buy some new ferries, and they think that we do need new ones, but exactly what that process is going to look like is unclear. And it's worth noting the grounding accident that happened, not fully related to the cancellation of the contracts, but it's put that spotlight back on, and suddenly we're all realising maybe those contracts aren't as cancelled as we thought they were.
And we had that debate in the House around it, and there was a lot of discussion around the cost of cancelling the contracts, how high that is going to be, especially in this economic environment that we're in at the moment. Well, if you're cancelling it, but then that's going to cost the taxpayer a whole lot of money, is that a good decision? And yeah, so there has been a lot of discussion around all of this at the moment. The other thing that has come up a lot this week around the ferry discussion has been the talk of asset sales. And I don't really know how we ended up back here, but this question has been asked a few times. Of course, we have David Seymour as a key part of the coalition government who just wants to sell it all. He is a big fan of selling off state assets, and he's made no secret of that this week, that he's continuing to push for that. At the same time, we've had Christopher Luxon and Transport Minister Simeon Brown both refusing to rule out the sale of KiwiRail, which I think is absolutely bizarre. It's quite a strange thing. I've been waiting for someone else to sweep in and say it's absolutely off the cards. Christopher Luxon has just said, I've told you, I could not be more clear, asset sales are not a priority of this government. And I think he would do well to just rule it out, because at the moment there's now that's added another question to the mix. Of course, state asset sales are incredibly controversial, and they probably want to be very clear on that as soon as possible, I would think. Now, Tim, I mean, this raises broader questions, I guess, around infrastructure as well. This government says it wants to build a lot of it. Should we believe them on this, do you think?
Look, I think we should believe them. There's so much to do. The backlog has been known to every government for a decade, and the latest figures put it at, $100 and something billion and growing of unsatisfactory or missing infrastructure for this country. So they will have to. Whether they're a 3-year government, 6, or the next one who comes in, it'll be happening. The question is whether they do it with the new funding mechanisms that they are talking about. For example, PPPs with private sector involvement or at least investment. And beyond that, to value capture for the bigger roading, train, tunnel, those kinds of things, where there's going to be improvement for the local surrounding businesses and homes, so they pay more for the benefit they're going to get for this great new shiny thing. I wonder with the ferries whether there's a figure in mind for what is an acceptable total for the new ferries and for the land-based spend. So that they've rounded it up to a figure of $3-point-something billion, which was unacceptable. The ferries were still, I think, within 700 million or 5 to 700 million as ferries, but the rest was that sort of, $2.4 billion on land at Picton and Wellington. But what's an acceptable figure? If 3's not acceptable, and you have to pay again, probably at least 500, probably 700, some labourers try to say $1 billion for the ferry part of it. So you get your new ferries for $1 billion or 700 million. What's the acceptable figure for land, and how do you achieve that? Now, that they can do it cheaper, presumably because the new ferries won't be made as big and won't require as much to cater for them, but say you halve that 2.4 that it was going to take down to 1.2, you're getting to $2 billion anyway for this project, even if you cut it down. So we're talking, you know, a very big sum again. And so they can't run from that. They're going to have to commit at some stage to what's acceptable. What they might do is say that, for example, that the on-land investment in Picton or Wellington will be funded by PPP or by, even if they just decided they're going to do it from the regional fund that we know is out there, and Picton's a region. So there could be some inelegant sleight of hand where they say we're going to turn some of that money from New Zealand First towards the pro-rail, pro-regional thing. So the money's going to have to be found in a very big sum, and it might not be $1 billion lower either. It might still be within, you know, QE or $500 million of what's been junked now. But to answer your question, yes, spending is going to happen, the planning is going to happen, and it will. And this is even for things that aren't directly from the fast track. You know, these are other just roading and essential public works that New Zealand is desperately in need of.
And Tim, that $2 billion-ish figure that, you know, very back of the napkin, but that also doesn't include the cancellation costs, whatever they might end up being. So, you know, there's a world in which this ends up very, very close to that original cost because you've got the cancellation costs plus still actually having to do all of that new stuff. And as well, in addition to the PPPs, there's the XJPs, which is the Xi Jinping approach to funding your infrastructure, which, you know, the government has said that they're potentially open to working with China and helping, you know, letting China help them fund infrastructure. So that's another maybe tap of money that they could turn on, but it has, of course, quite a few potential ramifications.
And Laura, on your question on privatisation, you know, so selling off 49%, as ACT is saying now, or the whole thing, we tried that twice. You know, Sir Michael Fay bought New Zealand Rail for some very low figure. Was it $1 or just a very small sum? And, you know, parts of it were sold, had to be taken back. The government's had to reinvest in rail. It doesn't make an earning for a private company unless they see there's some way of flicking it at profit, stripping, the usual thing. So look, that I think, while the theory of the market making better decisions of investment is still there and justifiable, tell me or name the party who wants to take this thing on.
Yeah, and you also mentioned Tim, New Zealand First, and that's another key component when we're talking about, you know, selling off something like Kiwi Rail and also pulling out the rail capability of these ferries. As people are discussing, we've got to remember that this whole deal was announced originally by Winston Peters when he was last in coalition with Labour. I think it's going to be very hard to get something like that past the Deputy Prime Minister, I would imagine.
But ACT could still try and sell New Zealand Post, which they've got in their targets, and TVNZ, but they're going to have to move fast because those two businesses are declining at such a rate that there won't be a whole lot left to sell.
I have got a riddle for you. What do politicians love to hate but can't look away from? It is, of course, a poll. On Tuesday, the latest One News Varian poll shows the coalition has gained a bit of ground after a couple of shocker rounds of polls. National was up slightly to 38%, New Zealand First was back over that 5% threshold to 6%, and ACT was steady on 7%. Meanwhile, Labour, the Greens and Te Pāti Māori all experienced a slight drop. Tim, this wee bump for the coalition has come at a time when they've had some pretty shocking headlines. How do you think they'll be feeling about these results?
Oh, I think in the, I was going to say smoke-filled rooms, but they can't be smoke-filled anymore, can they? But in the clinking of whiskey glasses in the coalition, bunker, they'll be happy with this. You've got to be happy with holding steady and holding almost identical to election night when you've had a pretty rough 6 months or 7 months. You can say that, they've done a lot and they've exacted the policies that they said they were going to do, but they haven't done it in a particularly effective and able way in a political sense, and we've all seen that, and they know it. And that's why the polls have taken dips at various times. But to get to this point, pretty much square, I think that they'd be pretty happy with it. If I was Labour on 29%, I still wouldn't find that acceptable. The 20s can't be a zone for the major other party to be sitting in. The Greens are still doing very well, but Labor needs to get lifting its game. And I think it went down 1, so it was even its good result. Last poll before was 30, and 30 is a total minimum. That was the zone of death identified by Judith Collins way back in 2020. So, they can't be muddling around at 30. So, yes, if I was in the coalition bunker, I'd be saying, OK, we've weathered a fair bit and we're holding.
Yeah. And Marc, how do you think Winston Peters will be feeling, on these numbers? New Zealand First is in Parliament and again holding a pretty important position.
I think Winston Peters will be feeling that this poll, like all the rest, is fake news. But it's true that, the difference between this poll and last poll, of the One News Varian one, which was in April before the budget, it showed Labour in a position to retake government. Big surprise after, only at that stage 5-6 months after the election. And that was because New Zealand First had dropped below that threshold. Now, in the numbers that we've got here, even if New Zealand First wasn't in the mix, National and ACT would still have a majority over Labour, the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, with some questions about how those Māori seats and extra seats work out, but broadly that they should be comfortable there. But it's much tighter without New Zealand First, right? And so when you've got this coalition that's heavily reliant on New Zealand First making it above that 5% threshold, you'd never really feel comfortable up until the point where they're either polling very consistently above it or you're polling high enough that you really don't need them.
And the other interesting aspect to this poll was the question around the budget, whether this is going to make a material difference to people's lives. And most people said either, they would be worse off or it would make no difference to their lives, which I think will be a bit of a punch in the gut for the government. They did a lot of hard work to get the money for those tax cuts and people aren't really excited about it. Now, of course, there's this question that we try to answer every week. When do the good times start coming for the government in terms of their tax relief? Is that once people see it in their pockets after, the end of July? Maybe the poll results would change then, but so far after seeing what the budget had in store for them, people didn't like it. And while I guess the tax cuts bit is the main part of the budget, we've also had the discussion around, cancer drugs funding and things like that. People who might have voted a certain way based on, promises like that they expected to see in the budget and then were not there might be feeling a bit disappointed as well, I imagine.
Up in Auckland, our partying starts on Monday when the fuel tax goes off. So we get the first benefit, the first tangible thing of this entire administration, I think, for your back pocket. And everyone will be watching to see how much the fuel companies take off and how much they live on.
How are you going to spend your extra money, Tim?
I think the estimate from Simeon Brown was $5.44 per fill-up for a car like mine. So, look, I'm happily going to go and try and buy a small black coffee.
Only a small.
Yeah, it's a pretty dire situation. That's the cost of living for you. Let's wrap up with some recommendations, something you watched, read or listened to this week that you enjoyed. Marc, let's start with you.
Yeah, on the subject of infrastructure, New Zealand's not the only country asking itself why it can't build big things. My recommendation is from Heatmap, a publication in the United States, about the saga of building America's largest power line. It took about 15 years to get going, getting permits from different state and local and federal governments, and then having to do it all over again. They've got very similar problems to us, but in the climate space, if we need to be building these big power lines and big renewable energy projects, hopefully someone figures out how to actually do it.
Cool. My recommendation for this week is an Associated Press backgrounder on what led to thousands storming Kenya's parliament and what started as a dispute over new taxes and ended up in some pretty deadly clashes. Worth a read there. And Tim, what have you got for us?
I'm recommending something that Newsroom published this week, which was a speech actually by Sir Geoffrey Palmer, the former PM, on the problems with our governance and system and our constitution, and how to get trust back and how to get more effective government that represents those voting. It's a very good piece, very thoughtful, and also at a very accessible level for all readers. So if you get a chance, take a look at that.
That is it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to our producer, Dave Filoi Ali'i, and our readers, listeners and viewers. Please send any burning questions you have to laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us next week here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.